Goebbels said, if you repeat a lie often enough, people will believe it.
All of their talk shows are controlled by extreme right-wing Republicans. And it is a front for the right wing of the Republican Party.
John Ellis, the head of Fox's election desk, Jeb and George W. Bush's first cousin. And it's notable that on election night, the first network to declare that George W. Bush had won the presidency of the United States was Fox. And it was John Ellis who made the calculation and the determination that they should make that call.
But it's not only Fox. At GE, the wall between journalism and politics was also broken. According to the Reuters news service, former General Electric chairman Jack Welch came into the NBC studio and insisted that the race be called for fellow Republican George Bush. All the while, an NBC in-house taping system was recording Welch in the studio that night. NBC refused to turn over the tape despite repeated requests from Congressman Henry Waxman. NBC President Andrew Lack claimed turning over the tape would infringe on the editorial process. Waxman replied, "Mr. Welch is not a journalist."
And we now know the studies show pretty clearly, as they understood, they lost the vote. If there had been a fair vote, they would have been out of power.
Calling the election for George Bush that night set the tone for any recount scenarios.
And the whole tenor of the coverage followed that. If you watch Chris Matthews, O'Reilly, Brian Williams, when is Gore going to finally give up? Another desperation measure by Gore. The assumption being Bush had won. Gore is just scrambling, trying to sneak his way in through some loophole.
The irony is that as the corporate news media has moved to the right, charges of a liberal bias have become pervasive. This impression was created because the Republicans have an arsenal of on-air pundits, adept at polarizing opinion and ridiculing anyone who disagrees. And they can rely on Murdoch-owned media assets. Some stories disappear, others are repeated endlessly. Murdoch, in turn, gets his deregulation. A conservative pundit, Bill Salmon, has written a book about Al Gore's attempt to steal the election. I find out that the party launching his book will be full of lobbyists and pundits, and decide to go videotape them. Funny thing is, these behind-the-scenes operators don't like to be taped.
You're not allowed to film the building without permission.
As the right got more and more of a toehold in the media culture generally, through the efforts of Heritage and Hoover Foundation and others, that myth became increasingly serviceable, you see. You could cow moderates, much less liberals. You could cow anyone who wasn't a right-winger working in the media by constantly assailing them with accusations of liberal bias.
Or by assailing them about a lack of patriotism.
I'm Janine Jackson from FAIR, the Media Watch Group. I thought you might like to know that the Heritage Foundation has announced that Jesus would support a war on Iraq.
The argument is no longer made that news media are hard on Republicans and easy on Teddy Kennedy and Ralph Nader. That's not the argument. That argument is so ludicrous as it doesn't even pass the giggle test. The argument now simply redefines left-right entirely in ways that drop out core issues of class, core issues of corporate power.
The media does not discuss the growing inequity between the rich and the poor and the disappearance of the middle class. I could go on and on and on. There is no evidence whatsoever for the claim that there's a liberal bias in the media. It's based entirely on a stereotypic view of the reporters themselves, many of whom may be liberals. Probably they're centrists by now. But the fact is that their own personal views have nothing to do with what gets on TV.
Winston Smith worked at the Ministry of Truth. His job was to alter past news stories so that the version of the truth given by the ruling elite was never contradicted. One of the most troubling things about the media's handling of the 2000 election came a year later. A consortium of major news organizations hired the respected National Opinion Research Council, called NORC, to inspect the 170,000 uncounted votes. NORC was not allowed to characterize its findings. The media companies did that. And the disturbing thing is that they hid the truth by distorting the Florida Supreme Court's actual ruling, which called for the counting of all votes where the intent of the voter was clear. According to the BBC's Greg Palast, who watched the NORC counting operation firsthand, one counter said, quote, "It screamed at you. If someone circled Gore, exactly who do you think they wanted as president?" The consortium did not comment on the exclusion of tens of thousands of clearly marked ballots, which the NORC data reveals. Instead, the consortium came up with a tortured analysis that showed Bush would have retained a lead under one method of counting, just the undervote. On December 24th, 2000, on NBC's Meet the Press, the moderator, Tim Russert, said the following: "Florida, Florida, Florida is over. The board is now retired." And that was pretty much the end of the mainstream news media's coverage of the Florida recount and the Supreme Court's decision to stop the counting of votes.
Had Nicaragua had an election like this and the Sandinistas won, the very people who won the Republican election would have insisted that we not only invade Nicaragua, but that all the people who engineered the election be held for war crimes.
They know that they're not there serving at the will of the American people. They know that they stole this election and they created this fraud by keeping African Americans away from the polls. They know this. And they know they have very little time to enact their agenda because they know that they're going to get the crap beat out of them next time. Forget what the media is telling you, okay? This guy ain't going to last, all right? He knows it. They all know it. But if they would do this, if they would stoop this low to steal our White House, what else would they do? What else are they capable of? What else are they capable of? I want to know.
So what we have here is not the sunlight of democracy, but the dark, ominous shadows of totalitarianism, despotism, fascism.
In a curious footnote, over the next 2 years, the Voter News Service, which had called Florida for Al Gore, was to be revamped for the 2002 midterm elections. Suddenly, exit polls had become unreliable. Then, on election night 2002, they weren't used. There were vague statements by the mainstream news media. As it turns out, the major networks own the Voter News Service. My guess is that the Voter News Service got it right on election night when they called Florida for Al Gore. According to congressional testimony, at that time, the Voter News Service projected Gore winning Florida by 7.3%, the equivalent of more than 300,000 votes. The Voter News Service was the smoking gun. It had to disappear. Welcome to computer voting, the newest twist in our voting process. With no paper trail. Uncheckable.
Of course, what everybody remembers is Big Brother. That's the cliche from 1984. Let me remind you of another part of the story. The leader realized that he needed the permanent war in order to frighten the people into giving up their rights.
What happens when a group of people have unaccountable media power and can redefine the rules without being questioned? On September 25, 2002, as the United States moved toward war, relatives of the 9/11 victims spoke. This press conference was not on the evening news.
My brother Jim Potere Dei worked on the 95th floor of the North Tower of the World Trade Center and lost his life on September 11th. And one of the hardest things I had to do was to tell my parents that they would not be seeing their oldest son again. No one victim of violence in war is less or more important than any other. So my brother, who was seen as a type of collateral damage in some fanatics' eyes, his death is no more or less important than the collateral damage of someone in Iraq or Afghanistan. It's a leveling commonality that we have with these people. And so for those people who are making decisions about leading us into this very dangerous era, they have an open invitation. They can come to my house over the holidays. My brother's birthday is right before Christmas. They can see what it's like to be around a family who's affected by war and terrorism. And we believe that this aggressive act, this unilateral act, will only inflame anti-Americanism that is already in the Middle East among Arab communities. It is a factor in leading fanatics to commit crimes against us like September 11th.
And they're saying to America, look, don't use this as a basis to go to war.
Without dissent, you no longer have a democracy. You have a dictatorship. And that's what we're getting from the White House.
Oceania is at war with East Asia. Oceania has always been at war with East Asia. Well, in the novel, of course, Oceania has not always been at war with East Asia. In fact, Oceania and East Asia were allies against Eurasia. But it suits the purposes of the inner party to make everybody think that the latest situation has always been the case. How is that any different from George W. Bush constantly mentioning the horrific fact that Saddam Hussein gassed his own people in 1988 at Halabja? How is it any different when at the time the U.S. actually had foreknowledge that he had chemical weapons, knew that he had gassed his own people, and did not protest back then? Saddam Hussein was a darling of the Reagan and Bush administrations.
The thing that is most amazing to me is the lying that goes on today. You are now teaching, I'm not making this up, we are teaching damage control and spin. I remember in this country we used to call spin lying. Now we call it spin and we study it and we admire it. How to put out a line of bull and have it fly for more than 24 hours, and then they high-five each other because they beat the other side if it's another party or it's another candidate, or it's another company, if it's one company with another with their annual report of their quarterly earnings or this or that. Public relations has overcome our whole society. It's all PR.
Tommy sat at his computer, turned it on and tied in to the world's mind. Hidden, brought up since a baby, with his enhanced memory, online and in line. Hidden, taught to take advantage of the symbiosis. Had been well designed. Crazy, crazy Jane is dancing. Crazy Jane's the dancer. Crazy Jane's the dance. See her, pirouette on sorrow, all corrupt